So guys, it is going to be a bit of a whirlwind, and I apologize in advance for information overload, but what I'll do is make these PowerPoints available to all of you at the end, and Simon can share them with you. There'll be some resources at the end as well, some links you can go to get more information, and I'm always happy to help people as well. So rather than just focus on that technical stuff about how to put a podcast together in a physical sense, I thought what I'd do is take the opportunity, while I had a captive audience, of turning you all into weapons of mass communication. Right, because podcasting and live streaming is all about mass communication. So that's what we're all about today. So I'm going to concentrate not just on the technical stuff. Let me come back into your line of view here and get out of your way a little bit. So I'm not just going to talk about the technical stuff about how to put a podcast together. What I'm going to do is cover what podcasts and live streams are and how they're different from perhaps some of the other communication tools that we might use. I'm going to talk about how to produce them. So types of content you can produce and use, that production process, and how to publish and distribute them, which is kind of tied into the production process. And then there'll be some questions at the end. So I am going to rattle through it a bit. So a podcast in its simplest form, all a podcast really is, a podcast episode, is an audio file that's been recorded, uploaded to the cloud somewhere where people can download it, or they can stream it and listen to it. Simple as that. It's a really, really simple process. A live stream, on the other hand, is simply broadcasting video direct from your phone or your camera straight to an online source where people can view that. It might be YouTube, might be Facebook, Periscope. There's a lot of different platforms we can use. So that's all a podcast and a live stream are. I guess a couple of key differences between them. A podcast is pre-recorded. It's usually edited, so you've got a lot of opportunity to to clean everything up and make it nice and professional. A live stream tends to be a little bit more raw because you are going out live. Anything can happen, and usually does. So it's a little bit less controlled, I guess. But we use both of them, both in my business and in Wet Tropics Waterways. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about two of my projects. I've got two podcasts on the go at the moment. This is the one I put together for Wet Tropics Waterways. So this is the Reef and Rivers podcast. And what I do on this particular production is I get together with some people around our region that are doing some really cool stuff. And I'm looking for positive news stories, good news stories. And we just have a conversation. And oftentimes the interview isn't scripted at all. There's no questions. We just go ramble away and have a chat. And then I upload it and we then distribute it to our listeners. So that's the Reef and Rivers one. This is the one that I do outside of work. It's called the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. I started this one in 2019, January 2019, at the same time, incidentally, as I started Reef and Rivers. So until January 2019, I'd never published a podcast before in my life. And in fact, if you went back a couple of months before that, I would have had absolutely no clue what was involved in creating and publishing a podcast. I'm a little bit further down the track than that now. And these two podcasts, very, very different demographics, different audiences, they different objectives, I guess, but they both achieve NRM goals. And interestingly, I'm getting some really good traction in terms of NRM and some of my messages about sustainability and waterway health through the fishing podcast, and engaging with a whole new demographic right across Australia. So it's really, really cool. So why podcasting and live streaming? Why not just bang some YouTube videos together and stick them up, or pump out some blog posts, or do the usual sort of social media stuff? Well, I guess we've got to recognize that the way that we communicate is changing. If you think back 20 years ago, television was the pinnacle, right? If you wanted to get your brand out there, and a report card partnership or an NRM organization is a brand, we need to get out there, we need to be seen, we need to be visible, we need people to understand what it is we do and why it's important. So 20 years ago, if you wanted to do that, you'd try and get on television somehow. You get on the news, or you get on a breakfast show in the morning, whatever you could do to get yourself on television. That was how you communicated with the masses. These days, television stations are bleeding. And I've got a colleague who, for 14 years, was a television producer. And he produced a show that cost him $50,000 an episode for a half-hour episode. And the television stations back in the early days were paying him $80,000 for each episode he produced. Plus he had advertising and a few other bits and pieces. By the time he retired that business a few years ago, he was paying $50,000 an episode to have it put on television. And so the advertising revenue wasn't keeping up with the cost of production and the cost of getting it on air. So television's completely changed, and it's very much in decline because people are referring now to digital sources. So we're live streaming Netflix and that sort of thing. We want to watch a movie, we don't go and watch it on television so much anymore. A lot of people don't, because we can watch it without the ads and on demand on other platforms. So things are evolving. But behind the scenes, podcasting has been slowly growing. Is anyone familiar with the Joe Rogan podcast? Okay, well, this is a pretty good indication of where podcasting is heading. So Joe Rogan is an American comedian, stand-up comedian, and since 2009, he's been producing a weekly podcast that ranges from an hour to 5 hours in length, where he has a bit of an interview and a chat with other comedians, high-profile celebrities, that sort of thing. Now, Joe Rogan's show, or the rights to Joe Rogan's show, have just been bought by Spotify, a little company that didn't exist more than about 10 or 12 years ago. Those rights have been bought for $100 million US for his show to be exclusively on Spotify. So television out, podcasting very much on the up and up. So podcasting hits a different, in terms of NRM audiences at least, podcasting hits a very different demographic, and it hits them in a different way. So one of the things that I love about podcasts, I hear stories about, I mean, I get people that email me on a pretty much a weekly basis saying, hey, my fishing show is 3 days a week, and they'll email me and say, hey, when are you going to go 5 days a week? Because I commute to work 5 days a week and I've only got listening for 3 days. And I say, well, when you start paying me $100 million to put my podcast on Spotify, then I'll do 5 days a week, no problems at all. But so it connects with people at times when they're not sitting in front of a computer screen. And it connects with people when they're on a plane, or in our case, when we're trying to connect with growers, they can be sitting in a harvester and they're getting the message via podcast in a harvester. So it's a really good way to connect with people. It's also really, really engaging. And one of the things I've found is that when I go and do boat shows and presentations like that, where I do a physical presentation, not recently, of course, but when I was doing those, I'd find all these people come up and talk to me afterwards as if we were old mates and had known each other for 20 years. And it's because I've been in their earbuds 3 days a week for the last 18 months that they feel like they know me. And so you kind of build up this trust, and they talk to you as if you're mates, and you can, it gives you the opportunity to influence things, I guess, which is what we're all about. We really want to influence the community. But for me, the big advantage of podcasting and live streaming is all about the efficiency of mass communication. It really is very, very simple. And when I said you could put a podcast together and have it online for $5 a month, I actually lied, Simon. You could actually do it for free if you wanted to. That $5 a month is actually US, so it's $8 a month for us Aussies. If your budget doesn't stretch that far, maybe you need to go and find another partner or sponsor or someone to come in and fund it. So why is it important that we get involved in mass communications? Let me just come back onto the screen here. So this is a rally that recently occurred in Queensland. So I know we've got people coming from all over the country. You may have been watching some of the goings on in Queensland over the last couple of years. It's been rather interesting that there's been this group of dissident scientists who have been very critical of reef science, and they've been very critical of the process of peer review behind reef science. They've been very critical of the way reef science has been implemented into reef regulations and that kind of thing. And what they've done is they've taken these concerns and they've taken these criticisms to the masses, rather than in a scientific arena where they might be, these things might be discussed in a forum or in a conference or via peer review on a scientific paper. They've gone out to the masses and they've communicated to the masses. And of course, there's an element of the masses with whom their message has rung true. And in this case, it was the cane growers. And the reason that it rang true with the cane growers was that nobody from the opposing viewpoint, nobody from the reef science fraternity was really going out to the masses with the same vigor as what the dissenting scientists were. So what ended up happening was the whole thing finished up in a Senate inquiry. And of course, the outcome of the Senate inquiry was that they decided the science was rigorous, the science was strong. Yes, there's a couple of little flaws here and there, but that's normal, that's to be expected. They also found that the peer review process was rigorous and strong. That didn't need any bolstering. But the one thing they did say was, guys from the reef science community, you've done a crap job of communicating. And that comes down to what this is all about. So when I look at in our own backyard, this is, and Simon will know this well, this is something that Simon has done with our partnerships in the Great Barrier Reef Partnership Network. So there are 5 of us in the Great Barrier Reef Partnership Network. Of course, Wet Tropics being the northernmost, we're also the best looking, the most articulate, and by far the most productive partnership. Not that there's any rivalry going on between partnerships at all, right, Lee? I see Lee's here. Anyway, so we went through this process of reflection and self-assessment, I guess, and this is what we came up with across the 5 partnerships. We found that we've got really strong, credible science, which is great. That's really important because we need that in order to be able to put our position forward with some confidence. That's great. We've got reasonable cohesiveness amongst our staff. We're pretty well aligned with our stakeholders, so we've got that relevance down pat. We've got a few funding issues. I think that's pretty much the case across all of the NRM sector. But what really jumps out at me is that where we have fallen down is in that effective outreach, so that communications effectiveness. And I think we do it better when we're talking about agencies and when we're talking about extension staff and when we're talking about conservation groups and that kind of thing. We're not too bad on that. Peer-to-peer, we're pretty good. Where I think we fall down is that mass communication, which is why I think podcasting is so important. Now, let me give you an indication of what is possible. So I'm going to show you some stats from my fishing podcast. Now, obviously, it's a little bit harder to hit these kinds of numbers in NRM because there's not just quite the same audience. But since January 2019, I'm a one-man show. What I've managed to do with the podcast, let me just bring up the slides. So I've managed to get my posts into 1.5 million Facebook news feeds in that 20 months. I've engaged with 108,722 people. That's 108,000 plus people who have liked, shared, or commented on my Facebook posts. I've had over 200,000 video views, and those video views have largely come in the last 5 months because I've added live streaming into what I do. The podcast has had nearly 730,000 unique downloads in the last 20 months. That's people that have actually come to the website or come to a podcast platform, download it so they can listen to it. And I've spent exactly $0 on advertising to achieve all that. So that's just an indication of kind of the numbers that are possible. In NRM, I mean, with my fishing podcast, I'm probably getting more downloads on a daily basis than what we get on the Reef and Rivers podcast in a whole series. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on as well, because those metrics can be quite misleading. So let's talk about the different types of podcast formats that we might choose to adopt. So there's a few different options. So first of all, we can choose to be either a serial podcast or an episodic one. In other words, we can have a story that unfolds over a number of series or over a series of episodes, or we can have something that is just a series of, I'm mixing the terms up. We can have a series of podcasts that unfold a story one by one. Each one is sequential, or we can have episodic podcasts where the next one is not related to the previous one, and they're all independent stories in their own right. We can also have video podcasts. A lot of people do that using YouTube to host their podcasts, or we can just have audio, which is what I've chosen to do. We can have a solo hosted podcast, which is where we just have a single person, a monologue, such as you're listening to right this very minute. But hopefully we'll have a dialogue before long. So that's really good if you've got somebody who is a real expert in their field, that's got lots of information to share and can break it down into useful chunks and run a series of either a series or an episode, a bunch of episodes of related material. You can have a host and a guest. And if you're thinking about podcasting for the purposes of community engagement and stakeholder engagement, this is what I would recommend you do, and this is what I mostly do. So both in Reef and Rivers, this is solely the platform I use for Reef and Rivers. For the Australian Lure Fishing podcast, I use a combination of guest interviews and solo podcasts as well. Or you can do things like having co-hosts, a number of hosts, or several hosts and a number of guests as well, or panel sessions, all sorts of different things you can do. But really the easiest one, and the one that I find gets the most traction, is the hosted podcast where you have guests come on board and you interview them. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about content. This can get uncomfortable for scientists, I'm sorry. But what I'm going to say here is, one of the things about scientists is we tend to all be trained to present things in a particular way. And that way of presenting things is not the way they should be presented for a podcast. It's quite a different process. So for example, if I was hosting a conference or a workshop and I had a speaker coming on board, I might introduce them by saying, well, today we've got our guest speaker, Joe Bloggs, and Joe's going to be talking about imidacloprid in the cane growing areas and the transportation and fate of imidacloprid in aquatic ecosystems, the flux between water and sediment, and the accumulation of imidacloprid in sentinel accumulators. Now, if I was going to introduce that same speaker in a podcast, I'd do it like this. I'd say, you know, when I was a kid, my family used to go down to the river every Christmas. We'd camp on the riverbank. We'd catch a bunch of fish. We'd collect oysters. We'd collect crabs. We'd go and catch some prawns. We'd cook them all up over the campfire, and we'd have an amazing feed every night for weeks on end. And if we'd had any idea of the cocktail of chemicals that was in that water and how they might have been accumulating in the food that we were eating, we might have thought twice about it. And then I'd introduce the guest speaker. So a very different approach, but a much more, I guess, engaging approach to get people interested who aren't technical, who aren't scientific. That approach to introducing a guest or a speaker to a forum or a conference or a seminar, that's fine because the audience is expecting that and it meets that target audience. But if you're talking to people via podcast, typically you're talking to a much broader cross section of audience, and you have to assume that they're not all technically minded or trained. One of the things that I find with scientists and communication is that there's always this fear that, oh, you know, if I dumb down the science, I'm going to look like an idiot, and I'm going to make it seem really flippant and you know, like what I'm doing is not really important. And nothing could be further from the truth. You don't actually have to dumb the science down. You just have to communicate it in a way that people can understand. So I think most Australians would recognise this guy, Dr. Carl Kraszelnicki. Carl is a Nobel Prize winner. He's done amazing things, massive contributions to science, but he's probably better known for the fact that he's been on radio for the last 40 years, making science popular amongst kids and popular amongst the general population. Another good example, Brian Cox. I mean, this guy's a rock star. He's all over television. He's got millions of kids around the world following him, and he's a particle physicist, for God's sake. So, you know, if you couch things in the right way, you can make the science interesting. Of course, I don't even really need to introduce David Attenborough. So these guys are all highly acclaimed scientists. They've all done amazing things, made amazing contributions to science. They haven't been afraid to go out there and put some of their stuff into a context and a format that people understand and engage with, and the general population can get a sense of what's going on and really start to take an interest. And I liken the whole process to being a bit like a funnel. If you get a whole bunch of people from across the community and you tip them into this massive funnel, then along the way, you're going to lose a lot of those people when they get to the point where the science becomes too heavy for them, becomes too dense, too hard to understand. But you're going to have a trickle that comes out the bottom of that funnel. And that trickle are the people who are really engaged, who are really interested. They might have some technical skills. And if I can reach 10,000 people and 10 of those end up coming on board the partnership and contributing to the partnership or taking an interest and spreading our message, then I've achieved my goal. So it's worth you know, making the message really easy to understand so that we can reach all those people and we can find those nuggets in amongst our community that are really going to be our advocates and our champions. So I'm going to get off that platform now, off that soapbox, and the next couple of slides are going to be a bit of a whirlwind, so I apologize for this, but I'm just going to go through the basic process for those who are interested in creating a podcast or a live stream of how the production happens. So in its very simplest form, to create a podcast, you need a speaker with a microphone, and you need that to plug into a recorder of some sort. From the recorder, you need to take the audio file to post-production. Post-production is where we do things like add an intro, add an outro, tidy up the audio so that it sounds a bit cleaner and a bit easier to listen to, remove ums and ahs, remove stutters, stammers, repeat words, all that kind of stuff, make it sound a bit professional. From there, you can upload it to the cloud. It could be a Google Drive account, it could be any cloud platform really. And from there, you share the links out and people can listen to it. It's as simple as that. That's a simple podcast. Any of the people in this room today could do this afternoon and have their first podcast episode out this afternoon, no problems whatsoever. But what if we want to use the format that I'm suggesting where we have a guest come on and we interview the guest? And let me just say that one of the reasons that I really like this format is that by bringing guests on board, you tend to get a viral reach to your podcast. This is what's been so successful with my fishing podcasts. It also works for Reef and Rivers, but in a smaller sense. But by bringing a guest on board, when you interview that guest, you go away, you process the podcast, you schedule it to go live, and the day before it goes live, you send your guest an email and you say, now don't forget, your podcast episode's going live tomorrow. Don't forget to share it on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, wherever you're on social media. Make sure you share the link out. And so what happens is your guests share the podcast with their audience, and part of their audience then becomes part of your audience. And by every guest you add to your reach and you add to your audience, and it becomes this viral mechanism. So to make that happen, you need obviously 2 or more people. You can use a platform like Skype. Zoom works as well. Teams works as well. Skype's fine if you've got 2 people. You can start a Skype conversation. You can record it, go through the conversation, download the recording, and off to post-production with it. Teams is better or Zoom is better if you've got more than 2 people. You can record as Simon's doing now. Once you've downloaded it, goes to post-production. Skype, Teams, and Zoom all record as video. And so in post-production, you remove the video, you strip out the audio, you go through the same process, upload it to the cloud, and away you go. So really simple. You can have interviews with multiple people just by hooking in through Zoom, Teams, or Skype, free of charge. Now, this is how I do my podcast, a little bit different. I've been doing it for a little while now, and it's become a bit more serious. So I have multiple speakers coming in through a mixer, and that mixer gives me a little bit more control over the quality of the incoming audio before we get to post-production. So I can just modify and tweak that a bit. Then it goes off to an editor. The editor does his thing, goes through post-production, and then it goes to a platform called Libsyn. Now, Libsyn is a podcast hosting platform, and this is where the $5 a month comes in, Simon. So if you're hosting your podcast on Google Drive, or if you're hosting your podcast on some other cloud drive, that's fine. But what Libsyn does is it hosts your podcast, and then it allows you to syndicate it out to a whole bunch of different platforms. So when my podcast, I can upload the podcast to Libsyn. When they publish, automatically they go out to Spotify, Stitcher Radio, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Facebook, and YouTube. That all just happens without me thinking about it, right? And from there, of course, you've got a whole bunch of people that pick your podcast up from all of those platforms. Now, once people have listened to a podcast on one of those platforms, often they'll subscribe to it. And what that means is the next time Libsyn sends one of your audio files to that platform, they'll get a notification on their smartphone to say, oh, look, there's another episode of the Reef and Rivers podcast available. Comes up on their phone as a notification so they can listen to it. So it's a really good way to reach people. And that's kind of where I'm at with podcasting at the moment. Now, you don't need to have that mixer. That's just the way I'm doing it. It allows me to use studio microphones and have a bit more control over the audio quality. But you could do that quite easily using Skype or Zoom as well, and just connect that up to Libsyn. It's very, very easy. In terms of live streaming, in its very simplest form, we can just simply have a mobile phone in our face, and we can connect that directly to something like YouTube or to Facebook, and we just pick an audience up directly from there. So again, you could do that right now. Pick your phone up, connect to your YouTube channel, and away you go. You can do it on Facebook as well. If we want to go a little bit deeper with that, we can do it through Zoom. So if we have more than one person, we want to be on a live stream and we want to be able to share PowerPoints and that kind of thing, then we can go through Zoom, or we can go through Teams. We can connect that to YouTube or to Facebook directly, as I was talking to Simon about earlier, and we can pick up our audience that way. Now, if you're doing it on YouTube and you've got an audience that follows you, you can actually schedule the programs in advance so people can subscribe and they can get notification when the thing goes live. So that's all pretty cool, and that's all pretty easy. But what I like to do is use a platform called Restream. Now, this is a paid platform. They do have a free level as well, but I use the pay part of the platform because it gives me a lot more flexibility about what I do. Now, Restream's a little bit different to Zoom or to Teams. So, when we talk about live streaming, so we're kind of live streaming now, but it's in a conference type scenario. So people can come in and listen to this, but only if they're invited and they've got a link. Whereas with a live stream, what we're doing is going out directly to social media. So we're going out to Facebook, or we're going out to YouTube, and the public can see it, right? So you've got to be a little bit on the ball. You've got to have your messaging down pat, rehearse it a few times. You don't want to mess it up. But what Restream allows me to do is have up to 9 people on on a live stream at any one time, and have a panel session, share screens with any of those people, share short snippets of video, put up graphics and that kind of stuff. And then it feeds out simultaneously to a whole bunch of different platforms. So some of my live streams recently have been going out to 2 YouTube channels, 5 Facebook channels, and a website simultaneously. And we're getting audiences coming to all of those. And we can have 350, 400 people coming to those live streams and connecting with us all at once. And they're all chatting to us via the chat. And we get this consolidated chat that crosses all of those different platforms, and we can communicate with them via chat, or we can communicate direct on the screen, and we can bring their questions and comments up. And so we've been doing this regularly now for a little while. And as I was saying to Simon, we'll get 350, 400 people sometimes that are ready at the start of the stream. And at the end of an hour and a half or an hour and 3/4, we've still got 200 or 250 people, and we've still got questions coming in when we start to wrap the thing up. So it's really, really good because it actually allows you to engage in real time with your audience. And again, I use that same strategy. I find some really good quality guests, I bring them on board, and guess what? Their audience comes along, and I stream out to their Facebook page and their YouTube channel, and I bring their audience and bring it into my audience as well. So the next time I go out, my audience is just that little bit bigger. So it's a very sneaky viral strategy for growing your reach. So that's it. I'm going to get out of the scene here. That's it. This is a list of the resources that I've talked about during the presentation for both podcasting and for live streaming. Now, what I'm going to do, folks, is put some links into this particular PowerPoint slide, and then I'll send the whole slide deck across to Simon. I'm happy for him to share it with you guys so that you've got links to all of those things. But there's some platforms there for audio recording. So obviously Zoom, Skype, StreamYard's another one I didn't mention. It's a free platform. If you're only doing 45, or I think it's 45-minute limit with 2 people for a podcast, but for most purposes that's fine. Post-production software, you could use something like Audacity, which is free. It works on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it's suitably powerful audio editing software that is being used by radio stations. It's very good. Live streaming, you can use either StreamYard or Restream. They've both got free options, but the paid options give you a lot more reach, a lot more opportunity to get out and reach people. Hosting, there's a whole bunch of them. The one I use is Libsyn. There are others around. There are some free ones. I would suggest not hosting a podcast on a free hosting platform because if you have a problem, typically you can't get your feedback. So if you need to move hosts, you lose all your previous podcasts, which is pretty painful. In terms of hardware, I would recommend, if you're going to do any amount of this, getting a decent microphone. Even for live streaming, it's actually more important to have a decent microphone than it is to have a good camera. If your audio is terrible, people won't stick around. If your video is not great, but the audio is fine, they'll tend to stick around a little bit longer. So definitely get a decent microphone and cameras. Yeah, well, there's some good webcams around that will shoot things out at 1080p. I'm using at the moment a Sony mirrorless, which I think is a 4K camera, so it's a bit upmarket, but you don't need that. You can do cameras on your iPhone as well, or your iPad if you want to, and that's fine for most purposes. So folks, that is my whirlwind presentation, and I will get rid of the PowerPoints and come back on the screen.